Management Research. Hello and welcome to the Management Research podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Eugene. Hello and welcome to the next episode in my new podcast mini-series dedicated to well-being and how to establish well-being at your work using process management tools. And actually, originally it was the mini-series about burnout, but as people don't like the word burnout, I decided to change it to well-being because at the end it's just the opposite pole of burnout. And if you establish well-being, then you prevent burnout, hopefully. In this episode, we're going to talk about our book. Yevgen and I wrote a book about burnout prevention and process management. The link to the book will be in the description of the episode, but before you buy it, ask your library, maybe they already have it, that you can save some money. We do believe that the history is much longer than we think. The history of process management is much longer than we think. If you open a book in process management, they usually start with Taylor, who introduced the idea of scientific management. Some researchers start with Adam Smith, who introduced the notion of division of labor officially. But we observed that the notion of division of labor is much older. It was not formalized in a book, but referred to the theory by Alan Fiske, the relational model theory. And he's an anthropologist, analyzed the primitive tribes. He went to different places on Earth where they still have the primitive tribes that were not connected to civilization, that had no radio, that had no television, and he analyzed the way they behave. And he developed different models of relationships. If you want to know more, I had an episode on this, the whole mini-series on relational model theory. What we want to show that actually in his observations, he showed how the distribution of work happens, how it happened many thousands of years ago. That's what he claims. And he also analyzed and showed which of these models would transfer into the modern society and that we still rely on. So it means they are very robust. And this made us think that the idea of this distribution of work, of the organization of work, is a very old one. It was actually the crucial for the humanity to survive. When people started building tribes, they had to distribute the work. Somebody had to hunt, somebody had to take care of kids, somebody had to take care of food. So this distribution started already then. Then, what people are good at is actually war. We're good in fighting against each other. We fight all the time. And I don't think whether we have years in history when there was no war at all. So it is usually somewhere a war. And some states are still engaging into war conditions, although we know how bad it is, although we know the consequences. And still we have aggressors who believe they can start a war and do something. So the war history of humanity is actually the history of humanity. You can even look at the development of the civilization through different wars. What is interesting in war is that the role distribution and the work organizing gets to a higher level, to very new, structured, deep level. If you want to fight not with 10 people, if you want to have an army, you have to have a very strong specializations of your units. You can have the swordsmen. The swordsmen, they are good on the plain terrain, they can fight, they can do a lot of things, but let's say they cannot fight against the cavalry because cavalry has much more power, and actually with a small or big sword against the horse and the horseman with a pike wouldn't work. At least would work, but not so good as you can imagine. That is why they had to introduce a new force, which would be the cavalry. But if you fight in the forest, then the cavalry will not be so efficient, the swordsman would be better. And if you're in the field and you see the cavalry, then you need the pikemen. So the pikemen who will stand with the pikes in front of the swordsman and will stop the cavalry. Again, the pikemen are good in the field but bad in the forest because the pikes are too long. If you have any trees, you cannot find. And the whole history or the whole art of war is to organize your troop in a way that you have the correct troops in the correct constellation, in the correct terrain by the correct conditions. Because if it is raining, some heavy troopers will not be able to fight, but the light troops will be. The military brought it all to the completely new level, the organizing of work and the organizing of actually the process. it was not called a process, but it was one, the process of war, with all the preparation and all the capabilities that you had to develop in order to win. Then, one of the interesting organizations that we have found was the East India Trading Company. That was a business organization, and that just inherited or completely took over the military infrastructure. The generals, they had an own army. I think they even had several armies. They had a permission to fight. They had their own fleet. They had their own cannoneers. They had artillery. They had their own troops. The generals became managers. The troop leaders became middle managers, or surgeons became team leads, more or less. So, of course, at that moment, they didn't call it team lead. But the whole structure has been taken over, and the organization that we knew from military was taken into business. And as they became successful, they gave a great example to other organizations to follow this lead, to keep the same organization. And the way we organize our work, the way we build the hierarchies, the way we build the function, which function stands for a department, is the same idea that we had in military. We have different functions, we have to organize troops, we have to make them cooperate, we have to find the right constellation for the certain battle, for the certain condition, for the certain country, certain region, certain terrain, and so on. And actually, we learned a lot about the processes exactly in military, and now I think military has to learn from us because we had some advancement, and this advancement started happening with Adam Smith, who first of all formalized the notion of the division of labor. And on the example of his spin fabric, he showed how division of labor can help different nations to prosper and different parties in one process to prosper. Then came Frederick Taylor, who had an engineering type of mind and who organized this idea of division of labor into very small specific processes. The idea of conveyor belt, the idea that everybody is responsible for the small certain operations. You make people more precise, you make their work better described, actually bring it close to a process. But the process, at the moment, I think the process management and process thinking appeared only later. And with his ideas, he managed to revolutionize the business and the industry and production. Because if you know the Henry Ford and his conveyor belt approach, it was a radical innovation. Nobody did before in order to create one car manually, where 5 or 6 people worked on one car from nothing to the final car. It was very complex, very long, and people had to be very skilled. Henry Ford showed that almost everybody can participate in his production, that almost everybody can learn a very simple action, that they can produce the cars at scale. And after he did it, it became a big success, and organizations started organizing the work in this way, thinking about who is doing what, ascribing precise functions, and continuing producing whatever they are producing, the cars or the planes, at scale. In the next stage, we actually started thinking about why do we need all these functions? Because you can say this is the one who is responsible for, I don't know, screwing something, who is responsible for the cabin, who is responsible for the wheel. But actually, what we have is a kind of process that creates a product from nothing to something that the customer would require. And then we continued on this event. We had I think the first stage in this event was that we introduced the event system. So if I'm done with something, I'm giving a sign to the next person that he or she can start with the next operation. And we can look at the work as a flow. And this flow of one unit passing different stations until the final customer gets his or her car or whatever product they're buying is actually, this flow is a process. And if we want to be good, if we want to be productive, we may be interested in looking at this flow and not at certain functions. Because if you look at certain functions, we know it from institutional theory, if we create a department gets its own interest. It starts acting in its own interest with own values, own ideas, own power distribution that leads to the fact that each time we have to cross the boundary, each time we have to move from the chassis to the wheel mounting, which is, let's say, a different department, let's assume it is the case, then we have the communication issue between the two departments because they have different visions, because they have different ideas and so on. So finally, they started looking at the flow of the good or the service from actually the nothing, from the raw materials up to the final product. In the next stage, we came to the idea that actually we need to start with the client and we need to become more client or customer oriented. We need to start not with a warehouse, but with a customer request. This will allow us to organize the process much better and much more effective in the sense that we deliver what is actually being asked for. And this made us rethink the processes and they become customer-centric. And we started looking at the process, starting with the customer's request, and then how we can process this request in order to deliver through several stations the demanded good to this customer. In the next stage, we can say we came to the notion of digitalization or digitization, depending on which part of the world you come from. And with the digitization, the idea was to automate everything and make it as flawless as possible and make a nice flow in this process, introduce a nice flow to this process, have a good control over everything and get rid of some very simplistic operations. So many things could be substituted not only due to digitalization, but also due to automation. We can install the robots that will mount the wheels instead of people. You have fewer of mistakes, higher speed of processing, higher quality of processing, and at the end it becomes also cheaper for the final customer. Now we are in a very interesting stage because on the one hand side, the digitization continues, and we already have a lot of things in mind what we can do with the organization, how we can automate the processes better, how we can get rid of many routine work that is not requiring highly talented people and a lot of skills and can be just substituted by a machine. And that is why one of the directions for the business process management is the artificial intelligence, where not only the robots can be introduced to wield the mouse, but also the computers that will write emails and analyze different databases, analyze law documents, check for compliance issues instead of people. That will probably speed up the processes and automate them to a very high degree. On the other hand, many people believe that process management has reached its boundaries, that we have done everything we could, and now we have to move direction more theoretical, the organization theory direction, where we think about how the bigger things are organized, the routines, the capabilities, the organizational capabilities. And these concepts, they are much more abstract, they are very powerful in the sense that we will rethink how organization works. Starting from the conveyor belt to rethinking of the philosophy of a firm. Why do we need firms? How do firms work? This is where we actually want to say how we see the development of business process management. And we see that introducing artificial intelligence to speed up the processes will just increase the number of issues that we already have. Burnout became disease of the century, although it is not a disease in the strict speaking sense, but we call it disease of the century. It's just a work-related phenomenon. People have problem with coping with the boredom at the, let's say, at the Henry Ford, when people had to do only very simple operation all the time, and this thinking still remained. We have a lot of work where very simple things are being done. But we also have an issue with being overloaded by the information from different chatbots, GAI solutions. We have a lot of emails coming from the clients. We now create many more emails thanks to ChatGPT and other tools. We can create better communication channels, and due to social media, we can have access to the clients almost immediately. But it goes at costs. It overloads people. It overloads us mentally. It increases the level of tiredness, the level of exhaustion, cognitive exhaustion, emotional exhaustion, because each time you have to talk to clients, you get tired. And at the end, we get to the state of burnout as one of the radical examples. On the other hand, we don't want to go direction organization theory. They already have a lot of issues. We are not against it. It's great if we can contribute, but we don't think that the business process management has lost all its potential. Actually, we see that it's only discovered the whole potential. And this potential lies in how to organize the processes in a way that they are really customer oriented. And here here comes the trick. We see not the final customers who buy the product, but we also see the internal customers, the managers and the employees. How can we organize a process that will meet the requirements and needs and capacities and capabilities of the internal customers too? Not at costs of the external customer, but on costs of the neglection of what internal customers actually need. We see a high potential exactly in this discipline because introducing new technologies and focusing on them means for us to just increase the speed of the processes that led us to the mental health issues. So instead of increasing the speed and searching in terms of Henry Ford for faster horses, we need to finally develop a car. We need to find a new way how the business process management should look like. And this is what actually this book is about. So it was a bit longer episode, but I hope it was interesting, and we'll continue with the next one dedicated to the field of organizational psychology to also close this gap if you come from the field of process management and are not so good in the field of organizational and social psychology. See you in the next episode. All the best to you. Good luck and bye-bye.